Okay, so what we're going to look at here is the Vietnam conflict under Lyndon Johnson. So we're pretty familiar now with John F. Kennedy's stance with Vietnam, that Kennedy had increased the number of advisors into Vietnam. I think by the time he leaves office, you're looking at like 16,000 or so. Um, but from what we understand, prior to his assassination, Kennedy was going to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam and did not really believe that the conflict could be won through U.S. intervention. Johnson, on the other hand, he is also very doubtful about Vietnam. However, he's continually pushed by his advisors and by senior military officials from the Pentagon and from the CIA that larger troop numbers are needed, that Vietnam is worth fighting for. And of course, kind of looming over his head is the domino theory. You know, this idea that when Vietnam capitulates to communism, you're going to see nations in Southeast Asia, you know, like the Philippines, um, and a couple others close by that probably would fall to communism too. Now, we know now that domino theory was false. It didn't happen. But at the time, that was a major concern. So, what Johnson, when he takes office, what he's got to do is, first off, his predecessors, being Kennedy and Eisenhower, and I guess you could almost argue Truman a little bit because he provided some assistance to the French, all of them had pretty much made a commitment that they would stop communism in Vietnam. And for the most part, the American public in the beginning was supportive of the war and intervening and saving South Vietnam from the communists in the North. But Johnson and some very close advisors were skeptical of the plans. They were worried that it would be something they would get into and would not be able to get out of. Um, Johnson's hand is kind of forced. So you get the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we talked a little bit about in class, and this, of course, is when U.S. Ships, the USS Maddox particularly, is fairly close to North Vietnamese territorial waters, and the ship comes under attack by North Vietnamese vessels. Now, the incident is recorded as being unprovoked. And there's a lot of controversy around that because we were very close to North Vietnamese waters, and some people feel that, similar to the USS Maine, that it's possible we might have instigated it a bit, and that the incident was essentially manufactured as a way to get us deeper into Vietnam. After that happens, Johnson really doesn't have too much of a choice but to take action. Remember, we've talked about this. You've got to appear strong and tough on communism. And with this, you get Congress authorizing the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And this is really, really big because this authorizes the president to take all necessary measures to repel armed attacks against the U.S. and to prevent further aggression in Vietnam, aka basically, you have a blank check to do whatever it takes to defeat the communists in the North. This is going to come back into play at the very end of the war, but what this represents is an expansion of the executive power, Congress essentially giving the power, to the president to do whatever he feels fit to win in Vietnam. And it also kind of changes our strategy in Vietnam, too. So Johnson wins re-election in '64. He is now president on his own term, and once he is elected, there begin to be attacks on U.S. air bases in South Vietnam by the Viet Cong. And what the Viet Cong are doing is very similar to what we see today in Afghanistan. Basically, they're getting on like mopeds, and they were doing pretty much basically improvised explosive devices. They were blowing up these things next to the airfields. They were blowing up American aircraft. And so Johnson authorizes what is known as Rolling Thunder. And this was a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. And everybody initially thought that this was going to only be about 6 months. In fact, pilots were really eager to bomb because they thought, well, this is the real deal, but we're only going to be able to do it for like a month or two before it's over. And this is America thinking conventionally. We are approaching this as a conventional war. We bomb them, with such ferocity that they see the power of the American military machine, and then they say, oh my God, we don't want any piece of this, and they back down. But what we don't understand yet is that this is not a conventional war. This is a insurgency. This is asymmetrical warfare. And so Rolling Thunder, we're pummeling North Vietnamese targets, but it's not really affecting the attacks or the number of attacks by the Viet Cong against American bases and personnel. So early in 1965, in order to better protect American air bases and to begin offensive operations, Johnson orders the first U.S. ground troops to South Vietnam. And in July of 65, those troops begin heading out into the jungles, into the hamlets, and trying to clear them of Viet Cong rebels, and of course kind of discern who's good and who's bad, which in Vietnam, unfortunately, was incredibly difficult. At the same time we're dealing with Vietnam, in 1964, there are going to be riots in the Panama Canal Zone. And of course, the U.S. had seized the Panama Canal and made it a U.S. territory. So this is troubling because the Panama Canal shortened transportation of American trading ships and military vessels. We didn't have to sail all the way around South America. Instead, we could cut through the Panama Canal. And so if the Panama Canal was going to, basically be, taken over by rebel forces or nationalized, that would be a huge problem for the United States. In addition, in 1961, in the Dominican Republic, voters, constitutionally, it's an election, they oust a dictator and they elect a constitutional government headed by a guy by the name of Juan Bosch. In 65, the government is overthrown by a military coup. And Johnson and the Americans believe that this is an attempt by leftist forces, essentially communists, to overthrow the government and install a left-leaning government. And so Johnson sends 20,000 troops to the Dominican Republic to take control of the island to put down this rebellion. Okay, switching back over to Vietnam, though, during the course of this war, we dropped 3.2 million tons of explosives on the country, on Vietnam, and this is more than the U.S. had launched in all of World War II. Now, the reason I bring this up is, once again, you have to understand, guys, that the U.S. is fighting Vietnam how we fought World War II. But Vietnam is definitely not World War II. And bombing them is not going to defeat them. The other problem is General William Westmoreland, who is the commanding general in the early stage of the Vietnam War, comes up with this sorry, that's my dog. He comes up with this body count policy. And the body count policy was basically, we are going by the number of Vietnamese soldiers, Viet Cong, that we kill. This is kind of like our measure of success. Well, what ends up happening is, if you have low body counts, then you're going to do more patrols. So what's happening is soldiers going out on patrol, they might engage 4 Viet Cong guerrillas, and they might kill 4 of them, or maybe 3. But they're like, oh no, man, we had to have been getting shot at by at least 10. And so when the officers are writing down, the body counts, they're saying, well, we had 4 confirmed, but we think we killed an additional 10, but they dragged them off the battlefield. And of course, by doing this, you're saying, well, the body count's higher, we don't have to go out on patrol as much. And so this body count policy was not a very good measure of success. And once again, we're trying to win over the civilian population, and killing more people isn't really going to help us win over the population. The other thing going on is that, in contrast to World War II, the average soldier was about 26. Teenagers fought in the Vietnam War. We're talking 17, 18, 19-year-old kids who are being drafted to go over there and fight. There's Westmoreland. And those are that's a very famous photograph of people leaving a village that had been napalmed, and you can see the one girl is naked. Her clothes have been burned off her body from the extreme heat of the napalm strike. The kids who were fighting in this thing, the other thing is that they were poor and working class. 80% of the troops over there fighting were basically minorities and they were poor. And if you were wealthy and you could afford to, you would go to college, or you would use family connections to get you out of the draft. If you went to college, you could defer and you didn't have to go. So, of course, this means that people who can't afford to go to college, which are the poor and the minorities and the working class, are the ones that end up fighting this thing. The other thing that we see is between 7,500 and 10,000 women served in Vietnam. A majority of them as nurses. You also have combat correspondents and other roles as well. Blacks constitute about 31% of these combat troops. And for a lot of them, it's either you're pretty much living in an inner city slum where people are doing drugs and getting shot, or you go over to Vietnam where people are doing drugs and getting shot. But a lot of them choose the military because you get paid and you get food and you get to shoot guns. And this leads to just really kind of poor fighting spirit. A lot of these guys didn't want to be there. They didn't really know what was going on half the time. Leadership was very poor during the Vietnam conflict, and oftentimes it was very confusing. Um, and the expansion of our presence in South Vietnam doesn't really do a whole lot to stabilize. And like we talked about with that credibility gap, they keep asserting, the government keeps asserting, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, but the reports coming out are saying, nah, we're not. And so Johnson is in a real predicament here because it doesn't matter how many more troops he sends or how many more bombs they drop, they're not winning the war.